Hey guys, this is Raz, and I wanted to start this episode by asking you guys to do 3 quick things for me. 1, subscribe on iTunes to make sure that you don't miss a single episode that we're putting out each week. 2, give us an iTunes review so you can brag on us a bit and help other people find this podcast. 3, go to mycampaigncoach.com and subscribe to our email list so that you don't miss a single content update that we send out each week. Thanks in advance for the help, and let's get to the episode.
This is the My Campaign Coach podcast, where we talk about how to win elections. Every week, we let you hear straight from the best consultants, operatives, and candidates in the game, all for one reason: to help you win. For more information about how we can help you win, visit mycampaigncoach.com. Now, here's your host, Raj Schaefer.
Welcome to the My Campaign Coach podcast. Today we're talking to Aaron Harris about managing campaigns, the differences between partisan and nonpartisan races, and what you can do to avoid losing your race due to voter fraud. Aaron has been involved in running state and local campaigns for a number of years, both as a consultant and a campaign manager. For the last few years, he's been heading up Direct Action Texas, focused on helping the grassroots take action in changing local government. He's one of the few consultants in Texas who has extensive experience with both partisan and nonpartisan races and has learned a lot about the big differences between how those kinds of races should be run. The area where Aaron has made most recent news is in regards to uncovering voter fraud. His investigations catalyzed what is now the largest voter fraud investigation ever undertaken by the state of Texas, and those crimes were committed right in our backyard in Fort Worth. Aaron is a good friend and a frequent co-conspirator, and he's got some great advice for us today, so I'm excited to have him on. With that, Aaron, welcome.
Thanks, Raz. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. And knowing you as well as I do and having learned a lot from you over the last several years, I wanted to have you on to tell us about your background, what you've learned over your experience, and what our listeners can apply directly to their campaigns. So start out by giving us a little bit more background about your political past involvement and just your personal history, how you got involved in this game.
Sure. So like a lot of us, I started off as a grassroots activist here in Tarrant County. We're kind of known, and I brag about it, and I'll fight anybody that denies this. We have the best grassroots activists in the state right here in Tarrant County, and I'm blessed to have started right here as that. I'm a real estate investor by trade, and that allowed me more time than your average Joe to be an activist, and was blessed to help several campaigns as a volunteer, and got really engaged and involved. And, like yourself and others, once you get that bug in your system, you can't get it out. And so I was blessed to be able to just continually take the next step and get more and more involved. And over the years, it transitioned into now my full-time job. And as you mentioned, I've done a number of both primaries. We've had a lot of heated contested primaries here in Tarrant County and kicked out a lot of establishment guys over the years. And 2012 was our big victory here in Tarrant County, where we took over a lot of House seats. That was a fun year. And then I've also done some municipal nonpartisan races, everything from school bonds to city council races and water board races and things like that. So they are very different, but a lot of fun nonetheless.
Yeah, we've worked together on a number of those races, both the partisan and the local, and been on both winning and losing campaigns and learned a lot from both. What was it that really got you started? There was a point as a real estate investor you decided, hey, I'm gonna to start volunteering for these campaigns. What was that catalyzed that?
It's funny. It was the beginning of the Bush administration, not the end. When, if you recall back in 2000 when Bush won and he nominated his cabinet, and he had Rumsfeld and, of course, Dick Cheney was his VP and all these guys that he put in office, and Condoleezza Rice and all these folks. And I remember reading in the Weekly Standard and all these conservative reviews and all these newspapers about how we now had this conservative administration, how awesome it would be. And I remember one of the first things they tried to do was Social Security reform and some form of privatization. As soon as Bush brought it up, the media immediately started screaming and yelling that he was selling, our future down the road, and everybody was gonna find themselves old and broke. And Bush gave up immediately without a fight. And oddly enough, that was what made me go, wait a second, we can't even fight over something this fundamental. Where's our backbone? And that's what got me started to paying more attention and getting more engaged and involved, and it kind of went from there.
Well, it's definitely been a wild ride since then. Let's start out by talking about your experience on the partisan campaign side. A lot of our listeners, they're wanting to run for office or thinking about helping a campaign or managing a campaign for office, and many of them are at least the first look they give is towards the partisan side, and that's kind of where you started out. I know that one of the campaigns, the first one you managed, I believe, was Jonathan Stickland's state rep campaign. Talk us through some of the partisan campaigns you've worked on, and specifically looking at Johnson's race and how you guys ended up winning that.
Yeah, so the partisan races, we find ourselves here in 2016, and I find that they're so much fun. And the reason being, some people have gone before us, both at the national level and at the state level, and they've done a good job of defining for voters what it is we're really fighting about in these partisan, they're primary races, right? So these partisan races, we're in Texas, our districts, as they are in most states, are for the most part either Democratic or Republican. So our fights occur in the primary, and in Texas, those are in March. And so what we're really offering voters is a choice between two different brands or three different brands of Republican candidates. And nationally, you have groups like Heritage Foundation, Heritage Action, and others. And here on the state level, you have Empower Texans and Texas Right to Life and other conservative organizations who have defined for voters the difference between a conservative and a Republican. And voters understand that. They understand the difference between a Ted Cruz and a Mitch McConnell, for example, in D.C., or here locally would be the difference between, say, a Joe Strauss and a Matt Rinaldi. We know that difference as a primary voter. So partisan races are so fun because you're going out there and letting voters know that the values that they actually espouse, the values that they hold dear, are actually represented by these conservative candidates, not the same old establishment Republicans, which ultimately I think voters are just as sick of establishment Republican politicians as they are Democrat politicians. And so I love those types of races. They're very red meat. By red meat, I mean you can throw out good conservative issues and divide your voters. And when I mean divide your voters, from a data perspective, from a response, when you go out and do surveys, these are issues that are clearly defining. If somebody's pro-life or pro-abortion, that's a clear dividing line in a voter. And so these partisan races are so much fun. The reason I think they're fun is because I find that we have the numbers. The numbers are on our side. The majority of voters want a conservative elected official to represent them. So our job is just to explain to them what their two choices are. And what I find is that when we do that, when we do it in an articulate manner and we do it well, we win. And we win on issues that people like you, Raz, and myself hold very dear. And so I think that's a lot of fun, especially with a candidate like a Jonathan Stickland, or, we have Connie Burton, of course, here in Tarrant County, who give us the opportunity to really define those values to the voters. And what we find is that the voters reward those candidates with victories. So those are a lot of fun because of that, because you're getting to champion the very core issues that define us as conservatives.
Well, those have been a lot of fun for both of us, both with Jonathan's race and Matt Rinaldi's and Connie Burton's. These are folks that, like I said, we get to divide things up from the data perspective along clear dividing lines. Now, in Jonathan's case specifically, talk us through that first race, because that was a hotly contested primary, one that he started out running against an incumbent, ended up running against a new guy. Talk us through that race.
Well, the biggest learning curve of that race was both Jonathan and I had always been grassroots guys punching up. And I remember in that race, we sat in a room one day and we looked at each other and we had a conversation for the first time about how we were having to change our outlook on campaigns, on messaging, on what we were doing, because he was now the incumbent and we were defending his seat. In the past, it's so weird, right? And so we had always been these whatever disparaging adjective the establishment wants to use. They'll call us Tea Party. They'll call us, wild-eyed conservative. My favorite is movement conservative. They say that like as if it's a disparaging thing, right? A movement conservative is somebody who cares more about the movement than the personality. And I think it's a great thing to be called a movement conservative. And so as a movement conservative, we'd always been part of the rebellion and trying to oust the establishment. So in Jonathan's race in 14 was the first time that he and I were in a position of being the incumbent state rep defending that seat. And so what does that mean? For example, one of the things that we had to take very seriously was a consideration of the things that we did or said triggering the Austin lobby. So the lobby is a very opportunistic group of people. They're not as ideological as we are in the grassroots. They're opportunistic. Where they see blood in the water, they will spend money, and if they don't see blood in the water, they will stay out. So there was a lot of times where we discussed things. If we do that, it may or may not trigger more spending by the lobby. And so those were types of considerations that when our movement was younger, we didn't really think about because we hadn't been in a position to be an incumbent, having been in Austin for a session. So that was a really interesting experience with Jonathan's race. The nice thing about that race was he had a voting record, a track record to go on. He came out of that first session rated the most conservative member of the Texas House. So that was the best thing for us, was Jonathan could go out and say, hey guys, I ran on a promise to go to Austin and be conservative. And I did just that. He often talks about how everybody runs on the campaign trail as a conservative. I mean, even I heard John McCain one time talk about how he's a conservative. But, it's one thing to talk about on the campaign trail. It's another thing to go to D.C. or go to Austin and do it. So what we had in that race was a track record. We had every scorecard in the state of Texas ranking him either first or second most conservative. So he was able to run on that. And oddly enough, when your voting record is as strong as Jonathan's is, or Matt Rinaldi's, or some of these other guys, it makes it so easy to campaign on. Because once again, I believe we win these issues when we can show the voters. And what happens with these incumbents like Johnson and Rinaldi and Tony Tinderholt and others like that is they have clear scorecards, clear voting records to show. So from that perspective, it actually makes it a little easier because you're not just making promises now. You're saying, hey, I made a promise. I went down. I was tested under fire. I withheld the pressure and came back having fulfilled my promises. So that was a lot of fun in Jonathan's race as well.
Well, he fulfilled those promises in spades. I mean, it was very impressive to see somebody that stuck as closely as he did to what he said on the campaign trail. Because you guys had gone in there in 2000, and it was 2010, right? The 2010 races where Jonathan
It was
ran.
12.
Oh, it was 12. 12 is where he first ran. So in 2012, when he first wins, he was running as a first-time candidate with no political experience. You were running his campaign as a first-time campaign manager, and you guys go and you win this thing against an incredibly stacked deck. But you knew, based on Jonathan's voting record, that he was not only going to have a challenge the next time in 2014, but as we saw, he had a challenge his last cycle that was incredibly heated. And you guys, so I mean, you guys have had to be, really girded up for war for a long time, and it's been a great 4 years from the perspective of those things. Those principles keep winning, and Jonathan's now he's headed back for his third term, right?
Yeah, this will be his third term. And the thing about being as conservative as Johnson, and when you go down and actually stick to your guns and do the right thing, and you're unwavering in that, is that you're almost guaranteed that you're always going to be challenged. The Capitol Insider last cycle wrote an article at the end of the session that said that Jonathan Stickland is the only guy that Joe Strauss, Speaker of the House, wakes up every day trying to figure out how to stop.
And that's a fact.
That's a fact. It's also like the best thing somebody could possibly say about Jonathan, right? And the good thing about that is we all applaud him for that. The problem with that, if you want to call it a problem, is that he'll always be challenged. So he'll have to consistently be defending that seat, which he and his supporters and myself and others are happy to defend, but it does bring about a stress level and a work that most people just simply would rather not have to do. They would rather avoid. And so that's one of the reasons you see these elected officials who don't have a backbone. That is one of the factors is they think, if I don't pick this battle, if I just compromise on this issue or this vote, I might avoid just once, which turns into twice, which turns into 10 times. Then I won't have a challenger in the primary, and I can sit back and take it easy. Because, see, back to my comment a little bit ago, our districts are either Republican or Democrat. So if you don't have a challenger in the primary, you basically get to go 4 years without campaigning because in the general, it's a non-factor. If you're in Tarrant County and you're in a Democrat district, which 8 out of our 11 are, you're going to win in November regardless in the general election. If you're in Dallas County and you're in Matt Rinaldi's district, for example, and you're the Republican, you're going to win in November. So what these guys' goal is to not get primaried. And so when you're picking a fight with the leadership in the Texas House, who are a bunch of liberal Republicans, you're guaranteed that they're going to recruit somebody to run against you. So I think a lot of times as grassroots and as fellow people in politics, we don't give enough credit to those who actually go to D.C. or go to Austin and fulfill their promise and remain conservative. I mean, you look at the flack that Ted Cruz receives nationally for actually being a conservative. You look at the flack that Connie Burton is receiving right now in the Texas Senate for actually sticking by the values that we've asked her to stick by. And I think a lot of times we underestimate or undervalue the sacrifice and how hard it is to actually do that. And that's why we should really appreciate those who actually do it, because they are few and far between. But let's not forget there's a very real sacrifice that comes with that.
No, there's no doubt about it. Well, one of the things that I want to mention before I forget about it was that I loved about the way Jonathan ran this last campaign. So through Frontline Political Strategies, our direct voter contact company, we were working with you guys over on Jonathan's campaign to do several passes knocking doors through the district. And
that's right.
One of the things I know directly during the get out the vote phase of the campaign, we were out there knocking thousands of doors a day, and the campaign was knocking thousands of doors a day. We knew it was going to be a tight race. The speaker and his guys had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into this race, and it was coming down to the wire. And Jonathan, this is just one of my favorite things for a candidate to do when he's got that many people in the field. Instead of him being out there in the field where he could talk to one voter at a time or every half hour or 15 minutes or so, what he did was he sat in the campaign office, and every one of our block walkers had his cell phone number. And if there was ever a point when he had the voter that was undecided about support or a yard sign, they were literally instructed to say, hey, hold on just a second. Let me call Jonathan. I bet he would love to talk to you and answer this question. And Jonathan was literally, he spent the full day for several days in a row on the phone fielding calls from the 20 or so block walkers out there, talking to every single voter that had a question or a hang up. And the number of votes that he converted, pulled from undecided to yes, and the number of yard signs alone that he got put out there in supporters' yards absolutely blew my mind, and was an example of some very hard work on the part of a candidate.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really appreciate about Johnson, and I've encouraged candidates that I've worked with in the last few years to do, is to put their cell phone number on all their push cards and all their mailers. At the end of the day, voters really reward and appreciate an elected official or a candidate who's approachable, right? And so I experienced the same thing you're talking about. I remember one in particular. I knocked on this guy's door, and he asked me some question about how Jonathan's, stood on some obscure issue that honestly I didn't even know what it was. And I remember telling the guy, man, I don't know, but here's his cell phone number. Give him a call, and and he'll answer the question, because I just don't know. And I left and went on to the next door. And I remember about 5 or 10 minutes later, I was I was still on the same street, but I was a good ways down, maybe a couple blocks. And this guy comes running down the street. He says, hey. I said, yeah. He goes, I called Jonathan. He took my call. He answered my question. I can't believe an actual elected official would answer my question. Can I get a yard sign?
That's
and
awesome.
He tracked me down to get a yard sign. I gave him a yard sign. He went and put it in his yard. And I'll tell you this, when a voter reaches out to a candidate or an elected official, in this case running for re-election, if they talk to you, you're probably going to have that vote for life. And I'm going to use a stat that we all probably know, but that's, congressional approval rating is around 11%, goes up and down. But yet their re-election rating number is about 96, 97%. They get reelected. And the reason for that is because people will vote for the candidate they meet. A lot of people go to a ribbon cutting or, a new bridge or something at Lockheed Martin, and they'll meet Kay Granger or Michael Burgess or Kenny Marchand or whoever, and they'll vote for their guy. And so they might be upset at Congress, but they like their guy. What you want as a candidate is for your candidate, for your elected official to talk to as many voters directly as he can or she can. Because once that voter talks to that person, the odds of them talking to the opponent are slim to none, and they'll vote for you over and over and over again. So I highly encourage everybody to put their cell phone number on everything they can, especially their website. One of my pet peeves is when I go to a campaign website and all they have for contact me is an email or a Facebook. Please, campaign managers, candidates, consultants, don't let your campaign do that. Make sure that you're accessible to voters. If you're not accessible to voters when you're running, they know you won't be accessible to them once you're in office.
Absolutely. Well, and one thing that Jonathan did during that first campaign, and it has done a lot since then, and we talked to Matt Krause in the last episode, and I know that Matt, he knocked over 7,000 doors personally during that first race. And I think Jonathan, he knocked a similar number during his. And they continue to do a lot of door knocking and have that as a key feature of their campaign, because that personal relationship that they get with the voter and that their volunteers are able to cultivate, it's the best insulation you have against a challenge, and it's the best way to build relationships. Because the reason why those things are so powerful is that when a volunteer, or when a voter rather, goes into the voting booth, a lot of the times, especially these down ballot races, they're voting based on what they remember about an impression, not necessarily a whole lot of personal knowledge. They're just saying, oh yeah, right. I know one of three of these guys, or I've heard something good about them, or I think was good. And so they make their vote based on that. And if you've gone there to their door, you've talked to them on the phone, you've made yourself available to their contact, what they're going to remember is they care about me. They want my feedback, and they will represent me. And Matt and Jonathan, Matt Rinaldi as well. I mean, these guys have done awesome jobs of building those relationships, and they've all been those types of guys that have taken a lot of those arrows and challenges, and the fact that they've worked so hard has protected them, even in some tight races, from those kind of challenges with a lot of money and even being outspent by the speaker and by others. It's very impressive.
Well, that's right, and that's our secret weapon, if you will, right? You look at these races where Jonathan, Matt, Giovanni, Stephanie Click, they all got swept in at the same time in 2012. We had a big kind of Goldman as well. We had a takeover, if you will. The interesting thing about that is I credit that to Wendy Davis. And people say, what?
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Well, Wendy Davis sued over our redistricting, which is what delayed our primary. So our primary ended up getting moved from March all the way back to May due to the lawsuits over redistricting. And what that did was it allowed all of us that were challenging these incumbents, in some cases, these were committee chairs, et cetera, we were challenging. It gave us that many more months to block walk. We didn't have more money, but we had more time. And so the time gave us what we needed to go meet these voters one-on-one and knock on these doors. So when you hear, Matt Krause and Jonathan and the amount of doors that they knocked, largely, or a big factor in that was the delay in the primary due to Wendy Davis's lawsuit. So ironically enough, she was instrumental in helping us flip so many of these seats and have what ended up becoming the largest freshman class, I believe, ever in the Texas House. I want to say like 42, something like that, about 150. It was massive.
Well, we got Ted Cruz on top of that for exactly that reason. Ted would not have won if that race had been 2 months earlier, if Election Day had been that much earlier. Now,
That's
shifting
right.
over,
It was on the same ticket.
You're absolutely right. So shifting now from the partisan side to the nonpartisan races, kind of walk us through how you got involved in those, because your focus has shifted more in that direction over the last couple of years, and what you've learned that's different about the kind of the local municipal nonpartisan races.
Yeah, the first race I ever did actually was a school board bond, and it was a lot of fun. We actually defeated a bloated, really badly written school bond here in Burkeville. We had a total spend of right at $3,000 up against the school district's $250,000 education campaign, they call them, right? And we defeated it 57-43. It was an awesome feat. Since then, I've done a number of municipal races. The latest of which was we ran a slate of 3 in Colleyville this last spring, and we won all 3 by a margin of 63% of the vote to 63-37, and we had one already on the city council, Chris Putnam, and so we now have a 4 majority, and they're doing some great work up there in Colleyville. But so we've done Colleyville, we've done several other school bonds since then. Some we've won, some we've lost, and then also the water board that you and I worked on together. Municipal or nonpartisan races are an interesting beast, and I think one of the things that I watch people do is they come in and try to run a nonpartisan race the same way they run a primary. And so all the great things I was talking about earlier with the primary, where you can run these red meat issues, and where groups like Heritage Action nationally, but Empower Texans and Texas Right to Life and others have defined the two teams in partisan races and in partisan bodies of government. On the local level, the nonpartisan, voters still don't know what the definition of a good city councilman versus a bad city councilman is. There's no clear issue that you can go down and say, this city council member is, bad and this city council member is good. It's a very hard definition to put into voters' minds. So you have to know what the issues are in your city and communicate them in a way that's less red meat than you do in a primary. So you don't have, for example, one of your most red meat issues would be, life or Second Amendment. So you and I are both big Second Amendment supporters. Second Amendment doesn't come into play in a city council or school board race more often than not, or a water board race. So you need to know what your issues are. You need to define them in a way that relates with voters. The interesting thing, though, with nonpartisan races is the voter behavior. Voters' behavior is much different. I have documented and watched voters who vote for very conservative red meat candidates like, say, a Connie Burton, turn around and vote for Democrats and turn around in a nonpartisan race, turn around and vote for liberals, turn around and vote for bloated bonds in a nonpartisan race. But they would never cast a vote like that in a partisan race because they understand the difference in the partisan. But when it comes local, people are much more emotional and less ideological about their local vote. And so as a campaign, you have to adjust. And where I've had the most success in nonpartisan races is where we've adjusted and gone to very concrete, specific issues that relate to everybody. So let's take Colleyville for an example. We ran on a really simple platform that involved issues that everybody in the town understood. The first of which was in the year of Donald Trump was one that really resonated. And this was back in May before this whole thing really picked up steam. But we ran on one of our candidates ran on term limits. And this year, everybody kind of resonates with term limits because the frustration level is kind of a 9 out of 10, right, or 10 out of 10. But we also ran on water bills were really high in that town, and there was people getting over $1,000 water bills, and a lot of people getting $500 to $1,000 water bills. And so we ran on. The city's running their water as a profit center. We ran on that. people understood that. Why? Because they're opening their bill every month and getting these water bills. And we talked to them about very simple ways we were going to get that under control. And they understood it, and they bought the message. They understood term limits. They bought the message. We talked to them about some development going on and a change in the city planning. They understood it, and they bought it. So we gave them 3-4 different talking points that were simple to understand. They weren't hypotheticals. They weren't things that were happening to other people. These were things that were happening to them. Their water bill was coming in their mailbox every month, so they could see it. And so we delivered on those promises. We won that race. And then, incidentally enough, they put a lot of those on the ballot this last month in November just now, and they did them in the form of charter amendments. And term limits actually passed by 86.24%. Another thing we put on the ballot was ethics reform. We require now conflict of interest disclosures, not only by the city council members, but we also required it by the city manager, the police chief, the fire chief, and the development director, the planning director. So the staff also has to do a conflict of interest.
That's awesome.
And citizens love that, right? That one actually passed higher than term limits. Term limits was 86.24, and this was 86.54. A couple more people voted for ethics than for term limits. And so yeah, when you communicate a clear message, but the message is different. The message tends to be more in their backyard, their daily lives. You try to go in and run a nonpartisan race on the same red meat issues that you do primaries, and in my experience, you're just not going to find as much success.
Part of why I really wanted to have you on here today was that there are so few people that understand or they have the experience with both types of races. And we have listeners that'll be running for municipal races, from school board to city council, as well as on the partisan side, from state house and county level stuff to Congress. And for both the managers, the consultants, the candidates, you got to make sure you really make integral in your campaign plan those differences, because we've seen it personally being on the losing side. Your inability to do that is going to determine whether you win or lose. Now, shifting over, still on the municipal side, because this is where we've seen most of this voter fraud, you catalyzed what's now the biggest voter fraud investigation in Texas history, and it really came about by an accident. And we don't have time to go into all the details, but I'm going to link in the show notes to a full presentation you did on what you uncovered and really how you figured it out. Talk to me a little bit top level about how voter fraud occurs, where it is a real issue, and how campaigns can keep an eye on that for that and not let it make them lose.
Yeah. So we came about it obviously because of a race that you and I actually worked on together. And if you remember that night, you and I, of all people, were looking at each other going, the math just doesn't add up in this race based upon the data we were seeing, right? So we found in Tarrant County what is now being described as the largest voter fraud investigation in the state of Texas, but it's a massive mail-in voter fraud. And so what they've been doing is what we call illegally harvesting ballots, where they're taking in, using a variety of techniques, signing applications on behalf of people, sending in applications for mail-in ballots, and then harvesting that mail-in ballot through a number of techniques, oftentimes which involve fraudulent signatures and the voter not even knowing they voted, or the voter signing it under the pretense that they think they're signing a petition or different things like that. So these votes are getting cast in Tarrant County by the thousands. We actually have another one going on in a rural East Texas county right now where they're doing it by the hundreds. But in this particular area, a couple dozen votes will change an entire election. So we see this in Dallas County, in Tarrant County, we've seen it in Harris County, and now we're seeing it in rural counties. So it's definitely a problem. As far as identifying it and stopping it, it gets tricky. The best way for us to stop it is legislative reform. What we've done, I hope, will bring it to the forefront of legislators who are about to start a session here in another month. And I believe we're going to see some significant legislative reform come out of Austin in the next 7 months. And that's the crux of the matter is our election code is very weak. and written very loosely. It has so many loopholes that allows these people who are carrying these operations out to get away with this. But as far as a campaign manager, what can you do? I think a couple things. First off is you have to know your numbers. One of the things that is, Raz, you and I have talked about at length over time, is just pet peeve of mine are campaigns who don't know their numbers. And when I start interviewing a candidate or campaign manager and I start asking them, the first thing I always do is start asking numbers. And my famous one is dollars, doors, and donors, right? How many donors do you have? How many dollars have you raised? How many doors have you knocked? And it's amazing how many candidates and campaign managers don't even know that basic concept. But more importantly, know what you should be expecting. Know what precincts are going to be mailing in what. For example, in Tarrant County, here's a number that should bother anybody that understands numbers. In municipal races in Tarrant County in 2008, the mail-in ballot, absentee ballots, accounted for 1.8% of all the ballots cast. Okay? Raz, do you know what they are this year? They represent 28.7%. In 8 years, we went from 1.8 to 28.8%. Okay? Now, if you look at other counties, they're still in this single-digit range. 3%, 2% to 5% is kind of normal. So if you have a county like Tarrant, or say like Fort Worth in particular, where for some reason one type of ballot represents nearly 30%, and when it should represent 3 or 4%, there's your first problem. But you're not going to see that if you don't know your numbers and you're not studying those numbers. The second is, never be afraid to ask for records. One of the things I find with people is they're timid about submitting open records requests. They're timid about getting copies of applications, of ballots, and finding out what people are doing.
You're not very timid about that, are you?
I'm not. I'm not. But because here's the thing, the Texas law says that anything that's paid for with taxpayer money is subject to public disclosure, whether it's in the possession of the government entity or in the possession of one of their vendors. It doesn't matter. If it was paid for by public money, ask for it. Here's a perfect case in point. If you live in a municipality and you find out that the government municipality, school districts are notorious for this, okay? If the school district ran a poll, guess what? That poll was paid for by taxpayer dollars, okay? You should submit an open records request for the full poll, all the analytics. You want everything, okay? We went to court over that and won. They don't get very happy when they're spending your money to figure out how to message and campaign against you, and then you figure out that you can use that same data to counter their campaign. It doesn't make them like you, but it does make you still have the right to get it. You're still in the legal right, okay? So don't be shy to get that stuff.
So looking more about campaigns in general, a lot of our listeners are looking at running for office. And so we want to help tell them what they need to look for is important. What are some of the top indicators you look for in determining whether a campaign's healthy or is seriously on the ropes?
Man, my first answer to that would be data. Do they know what they're looking for? And so when somebody decides they're going to run for office, they should first determine why they're running for office. And part of that why is going to involve a proposition, if you will, a proposal to the voter of why they should fire the incumbent and hire you. And that ultimately leads to a set of messaging that you've determined as a campaign. And your job is to go out there and message the voters, and through that messaging, identify voters that are either supporting you or likely to support you, right? So it's what we call in the industry a hard support or a soft support. And we do all this, we're talking earlier about block walking. Of course, you do block walking, you do phone banking, you do polling, you do all these different voter contacts. And at the end of the day, you do it so that you can identify your voters. And if a campaign understands what the messaging is that's going to define a supporter versus a non-supporter, and has put in place mechanisms to identify those people, then that's a good start. What I find is I see these campaigns where they're doing a lot of block walking, but they've been asking, through the life of the campaign, they've asked 20 different questions. And what happens is the response to those questions all go into a database or a spreadsheet, and you don't have any usable data. There's nothing in that data that tells me whether or not they support my candidate and whether or not we should drive them out to vote. And so you have to define early on, these are the buckets of that we want to identify our voters. So that might be a voter who's conservative, however you're defining that. Maybe it's a Second Amendment supporter, maybe it's, a pro-life, maybe it's fiscal conservative. And so you identify those. You have to know how to put them in a bucket. And then what I run across, Raz, and you and I have talked about this, and this is my pet peeve, is I spend a lot of time doing that. But most campaign managers and most candidates don't know what to do it. They might spend 6 or 8 months campaigning, identifying voters that support them. And then my next thing on a healthy campaign is, what are you going to do with that? And you do all that for one thing, and it's called GOTV. And GOTV is an acronym that stands for Get Out the Vote. And so my next question to a campaign manager is, what's your GOTV strategy? What's your GOTV plan? And a good GOTV should take all that data and say, okay, these are the voters who support us, and we're going to get them to the polls. And the way you get them to the polls is by touching them over and over and over again. And what do you mean by a touch? Isn't physically touching them. It's going to be a phone call, an email, a knock on their door, and you keep touching them one way or the other until they go to the polls. So at the end of the day, the answer to your question, how do I measure a healthy campaign? The most important thing for me is, do they understand how important the data is and how to use it? Because you can go out and you can only kiss so many babies. You can only give so many speeches. You have to be able to get out to the voters at large and identify them and get them to the polls.
Yeah, a lot of campaigns, first of all, they don't go out and capture that data. It's not a priority to them to get out and knock the doors, to do that hard work. And then of the ones that do, like you said, they don't do anything, or they don't know what to do with the data. They may know that they want data, that it's a good thing, and they'll tell you to ask all these questions when you're going door to door. But when somebody gives me a list of a ton of questions they want me to ask voters at the door, my next question is, okay, what are you going to do with this? Because if they don't have a concrete plan, I'm like, well, I'm not going to ask the question. Because every question that you ask, every data point that you collect, it has to have a specific use. And that's primarily segmenting your voters into micro-targeting their most important issues, understanding why they support you, understanding their intensity of support, and really, like you said, it's all about going back to the get out the vote, that final phase of the campaign, and making sure you know exactly how to get them as quickly and cheaply as possible off their couch, into the polling booth, punching that button for your candidate.
That's right. When you're on the phone with the voter, or when you're at the door, outside your GOTV campaign, which is the last couple of weeks, when you're on their door, everything you say to them should be one of two things. You're either trying to persuade them that your candidate is their candidate, or you're trying to identify them on issues. And normally you have either a persuasion script or a voter ID script. Sometimes you have hybrids. Hybrid scripts can be tricky, but they can be done. But everything you're doing should be one of those two things. You should be knocking on voters' doors, persuading them that Raz Schaefer is the cat's meow and the guy to vote for. Or you should be identifying. And the problem I find is what you just said. People will hand you a script, and they've got all these questions on there, and you go, this question doesn't persuade them to vote for my guy because it's a question about them. Secondly, it doesn't tell me anything about them that I can actually use to drive them out to vote or to know where they stand. And so always think about that in every script, whether it's a phone script or a block walk script. Is this a persuasion script, or is this a voter ID script, identification script? And it should fall into one of those two categories until you get to the end, and then you get into your GOTV. But your voter ID and your persuasion scripts gave you the data you need to run your GOTV script, right? And so I think that's one of the mistakes we've made in the past is not putting enough thought process into our scripts, not being as intentional in our script making as we should be to make sure we walk away from that door with data we can actually use.
Yeah, I know that I've fallen victim to it. I've seen lots of campaigns. I mean, crafting a script is a time-consuming process, and it's really easy. You get an email from somebody saying, "Hey, write me a script. We got to put this in the field in a couple hours," and you slap something together, and it looks pretty good on your first reading, and maybe the candidate's all right with it. But it's really an important piece of the puzzle, because not only is it going to determine whether you have the information you need for get out the vote at the end and real actionable data, but it's going to, if you have a bad script, it's going to waste a ton of time from whether it's paid walkers or volunteers. I mean, yeah, the amount of resources you're going to waste by having a bad script is huge. Just like you wouldn't throw together, I hope you wouldn't throw together just a last minute press release that doesn't have spell check run on it and doesn't check for commas and grammar. You shouldn't be putting a survey into the field without really thinking about it, having specific purposes for the questions, and knowing that you even down to the answers, that your answers that you're giving them are the buckets that you need to divide into based on how you're going to message to them down the line. And that just does not get enough attention from most of these campaigns. What are some of the other things that as you're just getting your campaign underway, both from you decided to run to launch and kind of getting it out the door, that they need to be paying attention to beyond that initial data and block walking?
We always go back to the numbers, right? So the things to look for is, do you know what your core messaging is, and are you sticking to it? I think the natural tendency when you're in a campaign, there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of things going on. And the mistake that I have made a lot, and I watch other people make, is trying to react to everything and allowing the circumstances as the bullets start flying to get us off of our plan. And what I mean by that is you typically have in a campaign 3 to 4 talking points. Know what they are, and know what they are, and stick to them. Don't allow your opponent or the crazy lady in the neighborhood you just block walked to throw you off. Stick to what your message is. Where I've had the most success, I talked about Colleyville earlier. We had such good success in Colleyville, winning a slate with 63%, because we had our talking points and we drove the message and we never veered off of it. One of the biggest things I see, and I see this with my staff, we'll go out and we'll block walk and they'll come back and I'll say, "How was it today?" Say, "Oh, it was horrible." And I said, "Really, what happened?" And they'll tell me a story about somebody who was a really bad confrontation at the door. And then I'll pull up their numbers and I'm like, "You had 95% positive and 5% negative." But they allow that one negative or 2 negative interactions for the day to define their narrative, and they now want to respond to that. So my challenge to any campaign manager and candidate out there is, don't respond to the 5%. Don't respond to the 10%. Stay on message. Know what your message is and stay. And that's something I look for when I go out, as I meet with campaign managers and candidates, is I ask them, "What's your message? What's your plan?" And if they can't articulate that right off the tip of their tongue, that's problematic, because that's the core of what you're doing as a campaign. Everything's centered around those 3 or 4 talking points. The second thing I like to ask to kind of gauge where they're at as a campaign is I like to ask them what their budget is. And there's a reason for that. I'll say, "What's your budget?" And then I'll ask them how many voters they need, how many votes they need, how many people are going to cast a vote in their election, and how many of those they need to win, which is obviously 50 plus 1, right? And it's amazing to me how many people will, especially when they're first getting started, will spout off a budget but not know how many voters. And Raz, as you know, in a campaign, all your costs are derived from the number of voters you need to reach. A mail piece is going to cost you X multiplied by how many mail pieces you're sending. If you're going to knock on doors, it's going to cost you, what's it running these days, Raz? $350 a door, whatever, multiplied by how many voters you have. So it's always interesting to me how many candidates will spout off a budget, but yet they don't know how many voters. So my next question is, how did you come up with that budget? And so I challenge them on that, because you can't come up with a budget if you don't know your numbers. So I always go back anytime you ask me that question about the health of a campaign. It always comes back to those two things. Messaging. Do you know what your 3 talking points are, 4 talking points are? Are you sticking to them? And do you know your numbers? If you master your messaging and you master your numbers, that's a winning formula.
Well, and part of what I love about this conversation and really all these podcasts is those are themes that come up every time. And it's know your whys and why you're running, why you're the guy, why this office, and that's going to help craft your message. And know your numbers, know how many donors you got and how many you need, how many dollars you got and how many you need, how many voters you have decided in your pocket, and how many you got to go get. And
right.
These are simple. It's one of those things. It's simple, not easy, right? These are things that the process is simple, and that's why we started My Campaign Coach, is trying to help more people understand the process behind that, understand the how. We're telling you the what here. That's the simple part, but we want to help train you in how to actually go out and do that. And more candidates,
right.
if they understand those simple, not easy principles, guys, you're going to go out there and crush it. And so I think that's just so valuable, and that's why we keep repeating it so much. Oh, absolutely.
That's right. Don't deviate from that. Don't spend your time chasing all these other things out there. It's about your message and your numbers, your message and your numbers. And if what you're doing isn't getting your message to those number of voters that you've identified, then you're wasting your donors' money and you're wasting your own time.
Aaron, I can't thank you enough for coming on. Tell us where folks can find you online if they want to continue the conversation or get some more tips.
Absolutely. So our website is directactiontexas.com, directactiontexas.com, and then you can also find us on Facebook at Direct Action Texas. And if anybody wants to email me directly, they can email me at Aaron, AARON, at directactiontx.com.
Fantastic. Well, folks, we'll put all those notes in the show notes, and hope you guys will take Aaron up on that. He's got some awesome advice. He's a great guy to talk to. Thank you so much, Aaron. And with that, we'll talk to you guys again next week.
Please subscribe and rate us on iTunes to help spread the word. We'll be back with you next week with more campaign insights from My Campaign Coach.